The wind howled outside, its fury relentless, echoing the storm's growing intensity. It wasn't just any storm. The news had warned of something far worse. A flash flood, expected to hit the area hard. The emergency alert had pinged on his phone an hour ago, its shrill warning enough to put anyone on edge. John realized just how bad it would be. He tossed his phone on the kitchen counter and grabbed his bag from the table, ready to head out the door. As a former emergency responder, John had seen enough floods to know that waiting until the last minute was a fatal mistake. His house, nestled near the edge of the neighborhood, was prone to flooding. The road behind his property was his only route to safety, and the clock was ticking dot. Just as he reached for the door, his phone buzzed again. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered on instinct. "Hello, John." A strained voice on the other end. It was Larry, one of his neighbors. "You need to get out of there. The water's already rising, and it's coming fast. The road's blocked, though. They've got construction equipment all over it." John felt his stomach drop. "Blocked? What the hell are you talking about?" "I don't know, man. I just came from there. There's a barricade right across your exit." "Is this a joke? The road's been fine for years." He shoved the wind cut at his face as he jogged toward the back of his property. His car was parked at the end of the long driveway, and the floodwaters were already starting to inch closer to it. Time was running out. When John reached the end of the road, his heart skipped a beat. The access point, the only way out, was completely blocked. A massive barricade of construction equipment and caution tape lay across the entrance. The floodwaters had already begun to creep around the edges of the road, and the rising tide now lapped at the wheels of his car, mocking his failed attempts to escape. He stormed back to the front of his house and grabbed his phone. Dialing the HOA's number, he hoped someone would pick up. Someone who could explain why the hell this was happening. After a few rings, a woman answered, her voice devoid of urgency. Double quotes, "Hello, this is Jessica from the HOA. How can I help you?" Cal. "This is John from Willow Creek Lane. The access road has been blocked off." "Why is that?" "We've got a flood coming, and I need to get out." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that made John's blood run cold. "We're improving the infrastructure of the neighborhood." "Improving? Are you serious right now?" John's voice was rising. "I don't give a damn about your improvements. There's a flood coming, and you've just sealed us in here. Well, the project's been approved for months. It's to keep the neighborhood looking nice. You'll just need to wait until then." John's jaw clenched, and his grip tightened on the phone. He could barely contain his anger, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "Wait, until when, Jessica? By the time your improvements are finished, I'll be floating down the road. You people never asked the residents what we needed. You just made your decisions like it was all some game. We're just following the plan. You'll be fine. Just stay indoors, okay? Stay indoors." The words echoed in his mind as if they had been written in stone. They were spoken with such cold indifference, as if the HOA had no understanding of the danger that was fast approaching. John hung up the phone, but his anger was far from spent. He turned and ran back to his car, grabbing his keys. The idea felt like a betrayal of everything he knew. He wasn't about to wait around for a bureaucratic decision to save him. He was going to save himself. But as the floodwaters crept higher and higher, John knew it was no longer just about getting out. It was about survival. And as the road to safety remained blocked, he realized that this wasn't just a problem with a flooded street. It was about a larger issue of accountability, of people in power who thought they could make life or death decisions for everyone without consequences. His mind raced, and he understood with terrifying clarity that the situation wasn't just urgent, it was a fight for justice. The storm outside was relentless. The sky, a deep shade of gray, seemed to hang low over the neighborhood as rain hammered the streets with an unforgiving force. John stood at the front of his property, watching the water rise. The sound of the floodwaters swirling around his ankles filled the air, muffling all other sounds. He glanced back at his house, the large windows now reflecting the encroaching water like a mirror. It was happening, everything he had feared. John couldn't waste any more time. He pulled out his phone, dialing his neighbor, Larry, again. John's mind raced. Should he wait? He glanced back at the construction site, where the barricades were firmly in place. The equipment, meant for some vague improvement project, seemed so out of place now, as if it were mocking him. The water was moving quickly, too quickly. And the news had predicted it would get worse as the night wore on. His options were slim, and he ran to his garage, grabbed a crowbar, and headed toward the blockade. But as he reached the site, his heart sank further. The construction workers' vehicles were too large to simply move on his own, and the road wasn't just blocked, it was completely inaccessible. With one last look at the towering barricades and his worsening situation, John made a decision. He could feel the floodwaters inching closer with every passing minute. The water wasn't just a nuisance. Now it was a threat to his life and the lives of his neighbors. He needed to get out. The construction had to be stopped, at least long enough for the emergency vehicles to pass. He pulled out his phone again, desperate to get help. This time, he dialed the city's emergency hotline. 911. What's your emergency? The operator asked in a calm voice. I'm on Willow Creek Lane, and the road's blocked off. I need to evacuate. The HOA is blocking the only road out of here with construction equipment, and now the water's rising fast. People need to get out. John could feel his voice trembling, but he forced himself to stay calm. We've been informed about the roadblock, sir. We're doing everything we can to reroute emergency crews, but the rain is making it difficult. Please stay inside and stay safe. John slammed the phone down. Stay inside? How could he stay inside when he was trapped in his home, his safety threatened by a group of people who couldn't be bothered to listen to their own residents? The anger bubbled up inside him once again, stronger than before. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone stuck in this mess. Everyone who had trusted the HOA to look out for their safety. And their being he had a decision to make. Wait for a solution that might never come, or take matters into his own hands. He couldn't sit back and wait for help. He had to act. John took a deep breath and started back toward the barricades, his steps growing more determined with each stride. He was past the point of negotiation now. The only way to break through this wall, both literally and figuratively, was to take the matter into his own hands. As he approached the construction site again, he looked over the heavy equipment. It was clear that the work hadn't been finished. The machines were still idling, their engines rumbling beneath the weight of the storm. John moved quickly to the nearest truck and tried to open the door. It was locked. Of course it was. They hadn't expected anyone to challenge them, much less try to dismantle their operation during an emergency. Frustration flooded through him, but he couldn't afford to give in to it. The rising water was already starting to flood his driveway. Every minute was one step closer to disaster. He tried to break into the truck, but after a few failed attempts, he realized the foolishness of it. He needed a tool, something to break the lock or pry open the barricade, but there was nothing close enough to help him. He turned around, his eyes scanning the area. That's when he saw it, a massive pile of debris from the construction site. He could use them to make his way through the roadblock, but first he needed to move them. The rain was so heavy now that it was almost impossible to see clearly. His vision blurred with the downpour, and his fingers were numbing from the cold. He moved toward the debris pile and grabbed hold of a large metal pipe. He could barely lift it, but adrenaline coursed through him, and he didn't care. The urgency of the situation drove him forward. He wasn't just trying to break through for himself, he was trying to get everyone out. If he couldn't move the equipment, he would at least try to clear a path. As he worked, his mind kept racing. Why hadn't the HOA responded to his concerns? Why hadn't they put the residents' safety first? The frustration built up, feeding his need to act. This wasn't just a simple roadblock, it was a symbol of something far bigger, a failure. To take responsibility for the well-being of the community, for the first time, he felt the full weight of the HOA's incompetence, and it felt suffocating. The residents had entrusted them with their lives, and now, with floodwaters threatening, their homes, the HOA, was nowhere to be found. John finally cleared enough of the debris to get to the base of the barricade, but his progress was slow. The rain kept coming down in sheets, and the wind howled in his ears. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was getting out. His hands were sore, his body drenched. But John pressed on, driven by a single, desperate thought: survival. The flood was not waiting, and neither could he. The storm's fury continued unabated, but John was too focused on the task at hand to let the rain and wind deter him. He was halfway through clearing debris from the barricade when he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance. The emergency responders were coming, but they were still far from the neighborhood. Even if they made it, how would they navigate the blocked roads? His stomach churned as he realized that the response might come too late as he moved more debris. John spotted a familiar face emerging through the rain. A neighbor. Michelle was trudging toward him. She was soaked to the bone, but her eyes were wild with concern. "John," she called over the howling wind, "you're still out here. You've got to stop. It's dangerous." "Dangerous," John shot back, not stopping his work. "It's dangerous to sit around waiting for them to come. The HOA has blocked our road, and now, with the flood coming, we're all trapped." Michelle shook her head, her face pale as she wiped the water from her brow. "I know, but the HOA has gone too far this time. This isn't just about some inconvenience. They've been getting kickbacks for this project. I heard it from Stan, one of the workers." John stopped, his heart sinking. "Kickbacks? What are you talking about?" Michelle hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. The HOA, they'd been working with a construction company, taking money in exchange for this project. It's all part of some deal. They promised to get rid of the old road and put in a nicer one, but it was never about improvement. It was about money. John felt a rush of disbelief. "You're telling me they've been taking money to block our roads and leave us trapped here?" She nodded. "That's what I heard. And it gets worse. You know that HOA board member, Karen, the one who pushed the project through? She's been getting paid off by the construction company for months. The rest of us didn't know a thing. Until recently, John's mind raced. This wasn't just incompetence, it was corruption. The HOA had deliberately put the residents in danger for their own financial gain. All those months of emails, phone calls, and concerns he'd raised had been dismissed as if they were nothing. Now he knew why. They hadn't cared. Not about the flood risk, not about the community's safety. They had been too busy counting their profits, lining their pockets, and ignoring the voices of the very people who depended on them. Michelle's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. The construction project hadn't been about beautification at all. It had been a money-making scheme. A scheme that, ironically, had now trapped everyone in their homes as floodwaters quickly encroached. The HOA's failure was far worse than John had ever imagined. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. It wasn't just one mistake. This was systematic, a pattern of indifference, neglect, and self-interest. And the residents had paid the price. "Where's Karen now?" John asked, his voice tight with anger. "Probably at home, safe and dry," Michelle said bitterly. "She hasn't been here since the project started. It's always been the same. She pushes through whatever she wants, and when things go wrong, she disappears. But she's still getting paid, and we're stuck with the consequences." John's heart pounded as he absorbed the full scope of what Michelle had said. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They had never cared about his safety, nor the safety of anyone else. They'd made decisions for personal gain, with no regard for the consequences. As Michelle spoke, John's mind began to turn. He had always known that the HOA was inefficient, but he had never suspected this level of corruption. It wasn't just about a poorly planned roadblock or a delayed construction project. This was about a group of people in power manipulating the system to benefit themselves, no matter who they hurt in the process. And now, as floodwaters rose, John and his neighbors were the ones paying the price. "I'm not going to let them get away with this," John muttered to himself, his fists clenching. "This can't go on. They've got to answer for this. They need to be held accountable for what they've done." Michelle's eyes widened. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to expose them," John said with determination. "If they think they can block us in, take our money, and leave us to drown in this flood, they've got another thing coming. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what's really going on here." As John spoke, he felt a fire inside him begin to burn. For months, the HOA had acted with impunity, making decisions that benefited only themselves. But now, with the community in danger, he couldn't stand by and do nothing. It wasn't just a matter of inconvenience, it was about survival. And it was about justice. "You're right," Michelle said, her voice quieter now but filled with the same resolve. "People need to know what's going on. We can't let them get away with this." John nodded. "Exactly. I'll make sure of." But first, we've got to get through this. I'm going to move the barricade and get out. Once we're clear, I'll go public with everything. There's no way they can keep hiding the truth." As the floodwaters continued to rise around them, John and Michelle worked together, continuing to clear the debris from the barricade. John's mind was focused not just on the immediate danger, but on the bigger picture. It wasn't just about this one storm. It was about every decision the HOA had made that had put people's lives at risk. The corruption that had allowed this to happen needed to be exposed. The sound of rushing water grew louder. But, for the first time since the flood had started, John felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't just trying to escape the flood, he was fighting back against a system that had failed him and his neighbors. This wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. The floodwaters were no longer a distant threat. They were here, surging through the streets, creeping up the sides of houses, and forcing John to act before it was too late. The rain poured down relentlessly, and the wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie, almost deafening roar. John's feet were already soaked, his clothes sticking to his skin as he worked feverishly to clear the debris from the roadblock. The road to safety was just beyond the barricades, but it felt as though the world itself was conspiring to keep him and his neighbors trapped. He glanced over at Michelle, who was standing a few feet away, pulling large chunks of debris aside. The rising water was beginning to swallow the ground around them, making their task even more difficult. They had to move quickly if they were going to get out before the floodwaters reached their homes. "I'm almost there," John called over to Michelle, his voice strained from the effort. He swung the crowbar with all his might, prying apart the wooden beams that had been hastily put in place to block the road. The barrier had been designed to keep cars out, but it was no match for his determination. Each hit of the crowbar chipped away at the wall of wood and metal, bringing him closer to freedom. Michelle nodded, but John could see the worry in her eyes. The water was rising fast. "We need to hurry," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "If we don't get through, soon we'll be trapped in here for good." John gritted his teeth, his muscles burning with the effort. The roadblock felt like a concrete wall in front of him, and the pounding rain only made it harder to see clearly. The floodwaters had already reached his driveway, and soon they would be up to the front door of his house. He knew time was running out. John managed to pry open a gap large enough for him to squeeze through. He paused for a moment, staring at the path ahead of him. It was the only way out. But he wasn't just thinking about himself. He was thinking about the entire neighborhood, about all the people who were stuck in their homes, unable to get out because of the HOA's negligence. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs too. Michelle came up beside him, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she said quietly, her breath coming in short gasps. "We can get through now." John nodded, but his mind was already racing. They weren't out of danger yet. The floodwaters were still rising, and the path ahead was uncertain. The roadblock had been a major obstacle, but there were still other challenges to face. He had no idea where the emergency responders were, or if they would even be able to reach them in time. The clock was ticking, and John knew he couldn't waste any more time. He had to make sure that others could get through the blockade too. "Get to your car," John said urgently. "We need to head to higher ground. I'll follow you." Michelle didn't hesitate. She turned and made her way down the makeshift path John had cleared, her footsteps quick and purposeful. John followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest as he moved through the rain-soaked streets. The floodwaters were rising fast, and he could feel the current tugging at his legs, threatening to pull him off balance. As they approached the intersection, John could see the emergency vehicles in the distance. They were finally on their way, but the road was still blocked for miles ahead. Even if they made it through, it would be impossible to get the emergency vehicles any further without clearing the entire path. John's thoughts were racing. The water wasn't just rising, it was relentless. The roadblock had already cost them valuable time, and now it felt like there wasn't enough of it to go around. John turned to Michelle, who had stopped in front of her car. She was looking at the water, anxiety written across her face. "You can't stay here," John said firmly. "You need to get out. It's too dangerous." "I know," Michelle replied, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "But what about the others? What about the ones who can't get through?" "John's?" mind flashed back to the conversations he'd had with his neighbors earlier in the day. He thought about the elderly couple down the street, the single mother with 2 young children, and the others who had no way of knowing about the roadblock until it was too late. They had all trusted the HOA to keep them safe. And now, they were paying the price for that trust. "We'll make sure they get out," John said with more conviction than he felt. "I'll call the fire department. They'll help us clear the path, but we have to keep moving." Michelle nodded, though her eyes were filled with doubt. She knew that the flood was taking a heavy toll on the neighborhood, and she didn't know if there was enough time to save everyone. John didn't know either, but he had to keep pushing forward. The alternative was unthinkable. With one last look at the rising waters, John climbed into his car. He turned the ignition and pulled away from the curb, driving cautiously through the flooded streets. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. The flood was still coming, and there was no time to waste. As John drove, he couldn't help but think about the corruption within the HOA that had caused this disaster. They had been more concerned about their financial interests than the safety of the people who lived in the neighborhood, and now people were paying the price for their negligence. But John wasn't going to let them get away with it. He had made a promise to himself that he would expose the truth. He would make sure that the HOA was held accountable for what they had done. The floodwaters continued to rise as John navigated the streets, but he was determined to push through. He had no choice. His neighbors were depending on him, and if he couldn't help them now, there would be no way to make up for the lost time. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. John's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as the water sloshed up against the car's tires. The streets ahead were barely visible, swallowed by the flood, but he kept his focus, driving slowly yet deliberately, navigating through the rising tide. Every turn, every street, seemed more treacherous than the last. His headlights barely pierced the curtain of rain, casting faint shadows of abandoned vehicles and debris strewn across the roadway. It wasn't just the physical obstacles anymore, it was the sheer weight of everything that had led him here. He had managed to get Michelle out, but John knew that many others were still trapped, cut off by the same blocked road that had nearly swallowed him. There was no turning back now. The destruction was already in motion. But as the floodwaters crept higher and the storm refused to relent, another pressing reality set in. The HOA's silence and indifference had to be addressed. Someone needed to pay for this, someone needed to be held accountable. As he reached the corner of Willow Creek Lane, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. Karen, the HOA president. Her posture was stiff, and she stood beneath the thin shelter of a half-collapsed tent. A few emergency vehicles were parked nearby, their lights flashing dimly through the downpour, but it was clear that she wasn't doing much to help. The police officers who had gathered seemed to be taking instructions from her, though none appeared to be focused on the immediate threat of the flood. John's jaw tightened when he saw her. He'd been expecting this moment. The woman who had initiated the roadblock. The same person who had spent months pushing through this so-called improvement project was now standing safely above the chaos, untouched by the water. But she wasn't just an observer. She was part of the reason this situation had spiraled out of control. He slammed the car door shut behind him as he approached her. "Karen," he called, his voice cutting through the storm. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen looked up, surprised, but quickly composed herself. Her expression hardened like a switch had been flipped. "John, you shouldn't be out here. It's not safe," she said. Her tone clipped. She gestured vaguely to the emergency responders, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "We're handling the situation. You need to go back to your house." John's frustration surged. "I'm not going anywhere, Karen. People are stuck because of you. Your roadblock has trapped half the neighborhood, and now we can't even evacuate properly. What the hell is going on?" The corners of Karen's lips twitched. She looked as if she was about to launch into one of her rehearsed speeches, but John wasn't having any of it. His words tumbled out, a mix of anger and disbelief. "You don't get to hide behind your little plans anymore. People are drowning out there, and you've made everything worse. Your roadblock wasn't about improvement, was it? It was about profit. You've been taking kickbacks from the construction company. I know about it. Michelle told me everything." Karen's face twisted into a look of barely contained annoyance. "This is a complex situation, John. It's not as simple as you think," she said, her voice steady but unconvincing. "The project was approved for safety, and we're working to improve the neighborhood. There's a larger picture here. John stepped closer, seething. Larger picture. While you're off somewhere counting money, people are stuck, desperate. And you're acting like this is just a minor inconvenience? You've been sitting on your hands while the rest of us scrambled to survive. You promised us safety, and instead, you gave us a barricade and a flood. Karen's eyes flicked away from his for a brief moment before locking on him again. I've done everything by the book. You've been difficult, John, disruptive. The board had a plan, and it was for the greater good of the entire neighborhood. I don't need you accusing me of corruption. You've been taking bribes. John cut her off, his voice louder now. I know about the kickbacks from the construction company. You've been paid to push this project through. Who gets hurt? And now, look where we are. You've put everyone in danger. You've put all of us at risk. How do you explain that? Karen's composure faltered for just a second. The cold, calculating exterior she usually wore cracked, revealing something else, a flicker of defensiveness, followed quickly by an attempt to mask it with indifference. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting. You don't understand. The bigger picture, John. These things take time. You think I can just fix everything overnight? Overnight? John's voice trembled with fury. You've had months to fix this. Months of complaints from residents, and you did nothing. People trusted you, Karen, and you failed them. The officers standing by had begun to take notice of the escalating confrontation. One of them stepped forward, his hand outstretched in an attempt to defuse the situation. All right, John, we need to keep things calm, he said, looking between the two of them. But John wasn't backing down. John shot back, his voice rising. People are stuck in their homes. The floodwaters are rising, and you've allowed this woman to block the only route out. How can you stay silent while she hides from the consequences of her actions? Karen's face darkened, and for a moment, John thought she might say something. More perhaps defend herself or accuse him of causing trouble. But she said nothing. Instead, she simply turned to the officers and said, "We're doing the best we can. The situation's under control." John took a deep breath, but his resolve only hardened. Under control, he repeated, incredulous. The only thing under control is your ability to stay above it all while the rest of us drown. He turned, walking away without waiting for a response. He wasn't going to get through to her. He knew that now. The damage was done, and Karen would never admit the truth. She would never take responsibility for the destruction she had caused. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that John knew the truth, and he wasn't going to stop until everyone else knew it too. John pulled out his phone and began recording, capturing the aftermath of the storm, the rising floodwaters, and Karen standing there, pretending like everything was fine. He would expose the truth, no matter what it took. This fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. The HOA might have thought they were above reproach, but John was about to make sure they faced the consequences of their actions. This was just the start of a battle for justice. John's hands trembled as he lowered his phone after recording the confrontation with Karen. The weight of the storm continued to press down on him, but it was the weight of something deeper, something far more insidious, that made his chest tighten. Karen's blatant dismissal of his accusations didn't surprise him. He'd expected that, or there was something about the way she had reacted, the way she tried to dodge the blame with such cold precision that gnawed at him. It was almost as if she had rehearsed this exact scenario in her mind, a defense built on lies, denials, and a carefully constructed image of authority. As John made his way back to his car, he felt the familiar surge of anger pulsing through his veins. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The floodwaters had made their way through half the neighborhood, and the emergency response teams were still struggling to clear the roads. Karen's lack of accountability, her refusal to admit what was really happening, had pushed him past the point of no return. This wasn't just about getting out of the flood, it was about exposing the truth and ensuring that the people responsible faced real consequences. But there was something nagging at him, something Michelle had said earlier. The mention of the construction company, the idea that the HOA had been taking kickbacks, it didn't sit right. John couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he knew. He needed to dig deeper. He made a decision. He wasn't going to let this go until he had the full picture. John's experience in law enforcement had taught him the value of digging beneath the surface. With Michelle earlier, and Karen's the one who's been getting paid off. Emergency vehicles were struggling to make their way through the blocked routes. John knew he wouldn't be able to rely on the authorities to fix this. He had to take matters into his own hands. With determination in his eyes, John drove to the construction site. The place was eerily quiet now, the machines still standing motionless under the heavy rain. The area was a mess of scattered debris, half-completed projects, and the constant hum of the storm's aftermath. It was a stark contrast to the polished image Karen had tried to sell to the community. There was no improvement here, only a mess of unfulfilled promises and blatant disregard for the people they were supposed to serve. John parked his car a few yards away, trying to stay out of sight. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find something, anything. His boots sinking slightly into the soaked ground as he walked toward the construction office. Paperwork and half-empty coffee cups. A stack of documents caught his attention. He pulled out one of the top files, scanning the papers quickly. What he saw made his heart race. There, in black and white, were the records of the transactions between the HOA and the construction company. The names were familiar. Krenz was at the top of the list, along with a few others he recognized from board meetings. What stood out was the sheer volume of payments, kickbacks, disguised as consultation fees and miscellaneous charges, filled page after page. The figures were staggering. John's mind whirled as he absorbed the details. It wasn't just a few $1,000s here and there. These were substantial sums, payments made over several months, all tied to the same construction project. It was clear now. The roadblock had been orchestrated as part of a larger scheme to funnel money into the pockets of those in charge. This was deliberate exploitation of the community for personal gain. His hands shook as he snapped pictures of the documents with his phone. He knew he had to get this information out to the public, but first he needed to make sure he had everything. He needed to back up his claims. This was the smoking gun, the proof that the HOA, including Karen, had been involved in corruption on a massive scale. As he backed out of the office, careful not to disturb anything else, John felt the gravity of the situation sink in. The HOA had manipulated every aspect of this project, from the roadblock to the so-called improvements, all in the name of lining their pockets. And what's worse, they had put everyone in the community at risk, leaving them to drown while they cashed in. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Michelle. "You got it? We need to go public with this now. People have to know the truth." He couldn't let Karen and the others get away with it. If he was going to expose them, he had to act quickly before they had a chance to cover their tracks. As he climbed back into his car, John's mind raced with possibilities. He could go to the press, release the photos to the public, or even hand them over to the authorities. But he knew he had to be careful. If he played his cards right, this could be the key to bringing down the entire corrupt system. As the storm continued to rage around him, floodwaters might have receded, but this fight for justice, was far from over. The storm had finally begun to subside, leaving a soggy, drenched world in its wake. The winds had calmed, but John's resolve had only grown stronger by the rising tide. Yet for John, the battle was just beginning. He had already taken the necessary steps to gather the evidence. He had the pictures of the incriminating documents, the records, showing kickbacks and financial transactions between the HOA and the construction company. It was all laid out before him, undeniable proof of the corruption that had led to this catastrophe. The truth was clear, but it wasn't enough to simply have the facts. He needed to ensure they reached the right people, the residents of the community, the media, and most importantly, the authorities. As he pulled into his driveway, the sight of his flooded home hit him again. His once pristine lawn was now a muddy, waterlogged mess. The reality of the situation was clear. The roadblock, supposed to protect them? The HOA had failed them all, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. John stepped out of the car, his mind already working through the next steps. He couldn't waste any more time. He needed to act quickly and decisively. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Michelle. "Meet me at the community center. It's time to go public." Michelle replied almost immediately, "I'm on my way." This wasn't just a matter of a few angry residents. This was a movement, a fight for accountability, for justice. He had spent hours gathering evidence, and now he was about to bring it all to the light. He was about to give the community the ammunition they needed to take down the people who had betrayed them, when John arrived at the community center, as he had, and he knew she understood the stakes. The two of them walked inside, where a few other residents were already gathering, their faces grim but hopeful. And now, they were here to make their voices heard. John knew that the first step in this fight was to get the word out. But not just any media. He needed people who could expose the truth to the masses. People who would tell the story as it needed to be told. The story of corruption, of betrayal, of people who thought they were untouchable, who thought they could make decisions that put lives at risk without consequences. John opened his phone and pulled up the contact for a local journalist he had known from his time in law enforcement. "Tara," he said, as the phone rang, his voice steady. "It's John. I've got something big for you." Tara picked up the phone on the second ring. "John, what's going on? Is everything all right?" "The HOA and the board. They've been taking kickbacks from a construction company." Tara's voice was sharp now, her curiosity piqued. "I'm on my way. Send me the details, and we'll get this to the news." John quickly typed out a message with the photos of the financial documents, the records of the transactions, and the proof of the bribery. He hit send and watched as the media took the first steps toward exposing the truth. This was at the moment they had all been waiting for. Within minutes, the first news vans began to arrive. Journalists from local channels, cameras rolling, were setting up their equipment, ready to report on the disaster that had unfolded. John stood at the front of the group, with Michelle by his side, as he addressed the crowd of reporters. His voice was calm but firm, his words measured but filled with the weight of everything he had witnessed. "The people of this neighborhood have been betrayed," John said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We trusted the HOA to keep us safe, but instead, they sold us out for their own profit. They've blocked our roads, taken kickbacks from the construction company, and when the flood hit, they did nothing to help. I'm here to make sure they are held accountable for what they've done. No one gets to make decisions that put our lives in danger without consequences." The reporters swarmed, asking questions, filming every word, capturing the anger and the determination in John's voice. Michelle stepped forward next, adding her voice to the growing chorus of outrage. "We want justice," she said, her eyes fierce. "We've had enough. It's time for Karen and the HOA to answer for what they've done." The truth was out. Now, the floodwaters may have receded, but the flood of revelations about the HOA's corruption was just beginning. The media began broadcasting the story, sharing John's evidence, and soon, the entire city was talking about it. The HOA was under fire, and the pressure was mounting. Legal investigations were launched, and the construction company was forced to defend itself against the accusations. The community, once divided, was now united in their fight for justice. As the days passed, the public outcry only grew. Petitions were signed, protests were organized, and the truth about the HOA's corruption spread like wildfire. People who had once felt powerless began to find their voices, standing up against the system that had failed them. The HOA board. Members were forced to resign, and Karen's once pristine image shattered as the truth came to light. In the end, the community got the justice they deserved. The roadblock was removed, the construction project was halted, and the funds were redirected to help those affected by the flood. But perhaps the most important victory was the knowledge that, together, they had exposed the corruption and held those responsible accountable. John stood outside his house, the storm long gone, and looked at the neighborhood around him. The floodwaters may have receded, but the fight for justice had only just begun, and he was ready to keep fighting.